Ethan had heard the rumors about the house on Willow Lane for as long as he could remember. People in town whispered about it in hushed tones, about the strange noises, the sudden chills, and the disappearances. But Ethan didn't believe in ghosts, not in curses, and certainly not in haunted houses. So when his friends dared him to spend a night there, he laughed. Easy money. The house had stood abandoned for decades, old, rotting, its windows shattered, and the paint peeled off in flakes. The lawn was a tangled mess of overgrown weeds and twisted branches. As Ethan approached, the wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the ground. He paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the iron gate. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, but he shook off the feeling and pushed it open with a loud creak. He stepped inside the yard, his heart beating a little faster. The house loomed over him like a forgotten monument. The front door was slightly ajar, as if it was waiting for him. He hesitated, but then laughed under his breath. It's just an old house, nothing more. With a deep breath, he stepped through the door. Inside the house, the interior was just as decayed as the outside. Dust-covered furniture stood untouched, as if frozen in time. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Ethan pulled out his flashlight and shone it around the room. The beam flickered briefly, but then steadied. The room was large, with a grand staircase leading to the second floor. Every step he took echoed in the silence, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. There was something unsettling about the silence in the house. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, heavy. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though he knew that was impossible. Still, his eyes flicked to the corners of the room, and his breath caught in his throat when he thought he saw a shadow move. He shined the flashlight directly at it, but there was nothing there. Just an old grandfather clock, ticking softly in the background. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It's just the wind, he told himself, even though every hair on his body was standing on end. Slowly, he made his way to the staircase, his feet dragging on the dusty floor. Each step creaked ominously as he climbed. The second floor. The upstairs hallway was narrow, with doors on either side. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the air felt even colder up here. Ethan could see his breath in front of him now, small clouds forming in the beam of his flashlight. He turned to the first door on his left. It was slightly open, just like the front door. He pushed it open with a shaky hand. The room was a child's bedroom. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a small bed sat in the center, its sheets rumpled and torn. The window was broken, letting in a cold draft. Ethan's flashlight flickered again. This time, it didn't stop. The light sputtered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. "Great," he muttered, tapping the flashlight. It flickered back to life for a brief second, and in that second, Ethan saw something. A face, pale with wide, sunken eyes, staring directly at him from the corner of the room. He gasped and stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, spinning and throwing wild beams of light around the room. Ethan scrambled to pick it up, his heart racing. When he shone the light back on the corner, the face was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. In fact, it was stronger now, much stronger. The cries in the dark. Just as Ethan was about to leave the room, he heard it. A faint sound, crying, soft, like the sobs of a child. It was coming from down the hall. No, he thought, this can't be happening. But the crying grew louder, and Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He stepped out of the room and moved toward the sound. The crying led him to the last door at the end of the hall. It was shut tight, unlike the others. The sobs were coming from behind it. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run. But instead, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside was a dark, empty room. No furniture, no windows, just 4 bare walls. But the crying was still there, louder now, filling the room. Ethan stepped inside, shining his flashlight around. There was nothing, no one. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Ethan spun around and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, low whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, filled with malice. Ethan's breath quickened as he backed into the center of the room, his eyes darting around. His flashlight flickered and went out again, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with it, his hands shaking, and then in the darkness he heard it. A laugh, soft at first but growing louder, echoing around the room. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding him. Panicking, Ethan banged on the door. "Let me out," he yelled, but the laughter only grew louder, more sinister. Suddenly, the room went completely silent, and then a cold hand grabbed his shoulder. The next morning, Ethan's friends came to check on him, expecting to hear him boast about spending the night in the haunted house. But when they arrived, the house was silent, just as it always had been. They called out his name, but there was no response. The front door was wide open. Inside, they found Ethan's flashlight, lying in the middle of the floor, its beam flickering weakly. But Ethan was nowhere to be found. They searched the house from top to bottom, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, and the house on Willow Lane remained as silent as ever.